Thank you very much, Sarah. Thanks to you and to Rose for the opportunity to speak to you this morning. I'm just going to give you a quick sort of story of how I've got to where I am at the minute on my PhD. As Sarah mentioned in her introduction, I'm about halfway through, getting on for halfway through a PhD, which I undertook after leaving my position at the Geological Society, where I used to be Director of Policy. And so this is a subject area I'd got interested in through some work we did at the Geological Society on responsible mining and responsible minerals. And I just wanted to give you a little sort of overview of sort of the journey of my thinking so far, rather than any sort of fixed point, which I've definitely not reached yet. I'm not going to do too much of the hardcore social science. That's the sort of full 2-hour bring cushions and snacks version. But if anyone wants to get more into the detail of that, then I'd be very happy to discuss those aspects afterwards. So really the starting point for my journey was thinking about the challenges that are posed by the long, complex, often opaque, interlocking, interweaving supply chains that minerals go through on their way from the mine to the end user and beyond. Various bits of terminology get used and bandied around and used a bit vaguely, but I find it helpful to think about this distinction between responsible mining and those sort of along the chain from the top end, if you like, approaches, and then responsible sourcing, which is thinking about the challenge from the other end of the pipe and thinking about the challenge to manufacturers of thinking where their resources are coming from and that sort of thing. And I'm not going to sort of labour the whole why we need minerals and what responsible mining is. You're hearing a lot about this from other people. But of course, responsible mining encompasses all sorts of things. And some issues grab the headlines, and quite rightly, human rights abuses and conflict and child labour and so on are really prominent issues and increasingly are breaking through into public awareness. There's all sorts of other issues. The environmental front, again, some issues tend to dominate over others, but there's a huge range of issues potentially. So as I started getting into my, how am I going to do this project, it looked more and more complex. There's so much to take on. And of course, that idea of responsible mining, we seek to assure through assurance schemes, and some of them are shown here. But on the whole, these are sort of driven from the top of the chain, from the mining end of the chain, or at least near to it, and they're rarely very visible further down the supply chain. These are not labels that are familiar to the public or even really to manufacturers on the whole, with some exceptions. So thinking about this briefly from the other end of the pipeline, responsible sourcing could be seen largely as something that manufacturers do. It's often more public-facing companies on the whole. Big electronics companies, electric vehicle manufacturers are going to come under pressure for this sort of thing, and so on. And so there's an emerging set of shared priorities, but often with a rather different set of objectives once you start to look under the bonnet, I think. And of course, it's also a shared priority with other actors in the supply chain, in the wider value chain. We're hearing about, over these few days, quite a lot about investor interest, which was the focus of the conference that a number of us were involved in organising late last year. So this is a shared set of priorities, and also looking sort of more widely at other stakeholders. So that's a positive. There's a shared problem, even if people have got a rather different angle on it. And when you think about sourcing materials responsibly, really this needs to encompass secondary resources, things that come from the so-called circular economy. But those tend to be regarded very separately from thinking about primary resources. They're not thought about in an integrated way. And this is something I've started to think about trying to pull together in my project. So this is, I think, a very unhelpful diagram in terms of thinking about what a circular economy might look like. There's a bit of a problem here, which is you don't see where any of the materials are coming from. It sort of implies that circular economy is just this virtuous thing which sort of hangs in space and doesn't need any materials. And I think we all know that's not the case. But why not? Many reasons. But some of the reasons are, of course, we're using a very different range of materials. The minerals needs of the future are not going to be those of the past. We're mining and we depend on a vast range of stuff from across the periodic table in the way that we didn't in the past. Resources stay in the system, and they can, that sort of residence time in infrastructure can be very long. So here's Iron Bridge, the first iron bridge in the world. The resources locked up in that bit of infrastructure have been there for 239 years so far, and no one's proposing pulling it down. So those materials are not available for recycling. And then, of course, if we want to actually achieve a sustainable, just life for a growing global population, that's going to take resources as well, which are simply not in the system at the minute. So here's a slightly more realistic view of the circular economy, of the sort of aim you might be looking at to think about more responsible use of resources once they're in the system. And those of you involved in the mining sector will be gratified to see that you're not completely invisible in this view of the world. There you are up at the top, in a little sort of nasty externality to be minimized, and you know, sort of the idea of minimizing inputs and minimizing leakage out of the bottom. But it's a much more constructive view of the world. And my project has moved into trying to think about what that top bit of this view of the circular economy might actually look like a bit, and how it relates to the bit which is more helpfully unpacked down here. So if we arrive at the conclusion that we can't do without mining, but equally we shouldn't be trying to do without circular economy and thinking about using resources more efficiently once we have them, some real commonalities start to emerge. Beyond just saying we need resources from both. So there are some common principles here. I won't go through them all in detail, but key ones, I think, are the need to rethink traditional business models, identify value creation opportunities, and the need to match actor objectives, so the needs of businesses, the needs of particular groups, the needs of consumers, and so on, with broader sustainability objectives at a system level. There are also, I think, some real shared opportunities. And some of these are very familiar to those in the relevant sectors, but they tend to get overlooked, both in sort of broad business-oriented approaches to sustainability that tend to see the linear and circular economies as separate things, and certainly in academic treatments of these areas. So I'm thinking at the minute about how we can bring these things together, and I've started to work on where do we actually want to get to, and what a transition to a more sustainable new minerals economy should look like. So this is really trying to look beyond what are the objectives that you might set at a sort of, as a mining sector, to say what are the ESG standards we might have, or what are manufacturing companies looking to achieve. It's trying to say where are we trying to get to at a system level. What are the drivers and the objectives at that system level? So I'm applying this socio-technical transitions framing that I mentioned in my title, and which Sarah trailed, which I won't go into in great detail, but I'll flash up a slide about it before concluding. It's a helpful view, I think, in terms of helping us to understand what that roadmap might look like. Where are we trying to get to? And then thinking about how does that match up with what individual actors within that system might be trying to do. What can a company do? What can a mining company do? What can a manufacturer do? So what is the socio-technical transitions approach? It's been typically applied in energy and transport, some increasingly in the food sector, agri-food. It's a really helpful way, I think, of looking at complex systems in change, and rather than simply critiquing how things are at the minute from an academic, from a social science point of view, thinking about how change happens and how localized change in niches, often in protected niches, that might be led by a company, or protection might be given by policy making or whatever, can break through and can institute wider change. And anyone interested in this, I really recommend the classic paper on it is this Hale's 2002 paper on the multi-level perspective. There's lots of other literature on this as well, and if people are interested in this, I'm happy to talk about it later. So I'm looking at applying this in the minerals ecosystem, if you like, this whole complex system that we know that minerals pass through, which is novel work. So I'm looking at it and not assuming it's going to just sort of automatically fit, and trying to develop a framework. So just briefly, this is where I'm going next with my research. I've got 3 case studies lined up, and in each case I'm going to be looking at the ecosystem, as it were, at the network of mineral supply and sourcing through the lens of each of these case studies. So I'm going to be talking to people within the case study organisation, but also in their wider networks, understanding what they're doing and where they're going in terms of responsible supply and responsible sourcing, what the barriers are for them, what the drivers are, where are the dependencies, where are the opportunities and risks, and then looking to line that up with this system level change that would need to happen to move towards true sustainability for the minerals supply system. So thinking about whether those could be better coordinated, what sorts of things the mining sector can do, what sorts of things manufacturing companies can do, what sorts of things other actors in that system might do most effectively that could be joined up with each other and which could move towards this broader system level change that we might all want to see. So I'll leave it at that, and very happy to take comments and questions, and also if people want to be in contact afterwards if they want more of the full 2-hour sit down with snaps version of the talk, which I can't fit into these few minutes, but thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you very, very much, Nick. And yes, imagine that round of applause that is now happening behind those muted sound bars at the moment. That's absolutely brilliant. Now, you did mention snacks. I see that you have coffee in your hands. Just while we're waiting for some more of the questions to come in just now, so I have in my hands the takeaway from our responsible investing conference that was run last year with the Geological Society. And this is something here where, and if anybody wants to take a look at it, and we'll make sure that we post a link to it on the website and also through the chat function in a minute or two. But one of the key takeaways here was that complex ecosystem of different stakeholders that all pile into this world of responsible investing. Is the work that you're doing at the moment, is that very much linked or kind of drawing from some of the information that came from that complex world of stakeholders, or how does it differ?
Yes, it does. So I sort of skipped over this slide and didn't talk about the illustrations down the right-hand side of the page. It takes a while to talk through this, and so this is just a couple of images out of a set of about 5 or 6 that I've drawn up as sort of thought experiments, if you like, of how change would need to happen on the way from a sort of linear mineral supply system where ESG factors and responsible supply and sourcing aren't really a consideration, on a way to a more sustainable joined up one with different system level drivers. And you can see in these diagrams that I'm thinking about the supply chain, but also the value chain in terms of where money flows and what other actors that draws in. And then potentially as these sort of wiring diagrams might get more and more complex as you think about other factors being at play, that wider ecosystem of stakeholders that have a role to play as well. So governments have a really important role to play in policy making in terms of setting the agenda and the boundary conditions in which these changes happen. NGOs play a really important role. Investors we've talked about quite a lot. And play obviously an absolutely key role right along the chain. So yeah, I'm sort of trying to move away from thinking either about a linear chain or indeed a circular combined with linear supply chain or even value chain, to thinking about a sort of network or an ecosystem.
Great, thanks for that, Nic. And I guess what this is showing, and it's the same as what we were hearing yesterday, is this is incredibly complex. It is certainly not linear. So actually you just got to start and see which direction, I guess, some of these players move in as a whole. And you mentioned that we can learn a lot from some of the other sectors, and that mining isn't necessarily the first sector to move with regards to this space. And a question that's come from Ludovine is that it's interesting that you mentioned examples of other industries, and that mining is not always the first to leverage experience from other sectors, ... Have you seen significant benefit in those other industries that would be transferable or applicable to mining? And if so, can you give us an example of it?
I guess I was thinking of those companies who are users of minerals, industrial users of minerals, so manufacturers who are more public facing, and they're feeling the pressure maybe more in terms of direct consumer pressure, or at least sort of inferred consumer pressure, and wanting to react and anticipate consumer demands and not sort of see the next backlash arise before dealing with it. But in terms of learning in terms of those supply chain and responsibility issues and up the chain, you might go back and look at this sort of other wing of this classic Ellen MacArthur Foundation butterfly diagram of the circular economy. And I think if you look at the detail behind this, it's not intended to imply that we'll just move into a completely circular system. Thinking about inputs to that, they might be biological inputs. So thinking about food, for example, thinking about fibres for clothing. So I think there's been quite clearly food. We've got a much more well-developed customer-facing system of labelling of some sorts of food, but also a much more highly developed consumer set of preferences and pressures starting to emerge in terms of provenance and where things come from. And similarly with clothing, with responsible fabrics and those sorts of things. So there are common challenges as well as some real differences. I think one of the big differences is there's not the place-based idea of, you know, your minerals have got to come from where they sit in the ground. You can't suddenly say, I'm going to get my lithium from Norfolk, because it's not there. You know, and also the supply chains are just that much more complex. So we can take those lessons, but we are putting them into a very different context.
Fantastic, thanks, Nic. So yes, we might not be able to get our lithium from Norfolk, but we may be able to get it from Cornwall.
We may.
More on that later in the week. So final question, if we may, Nic, and this comes from Catriona on the questions, and she says, I wish to approach the mining company I work for with regards to moving towards responsible mining, a lot of which they are already doing, but perhaps not documenting. Where do I start?
Good question. I mean, I think that's a really key point, that good, responsible companies are doing good things. They're not necessarily doing everything they can, but there's a real challenge to mining companies in terms of documenting and then accrediting what they're doing and getting certification for what they're doing, is that there are just so many options out there. It's a huge challenge. I think it's really useful to look at things like the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance in terms of a set of maximum standards, and some of the criticism that is made of that is it's too high a barrier to meet in terms of all the different categories that you've got to be able to report across and so on. But it's quite a good reference point. I think also just using things like the Sustainable Development Goals to say, what does real sustainability look like? Environmental and social responsibility and sustainability. And those are goals behind which all sorts of companies and people can gather, can coalesce, and that can get wide support. And other people have referred already in this conference to the idea that they're getting real traction. They're getting much more traction than I think necessarily was expected among companies. That's quite a good sort of rallying call to action in terms of, look, here's a good picture of where we really should be trying to get to. And then the specifics of what are we already doing, and then what could we be doing to pull in that direction, kind of follow on behind.